Hello and welcome to New Chip Demo Week and to our panel Beyond the Stars, Fueling Investment in Space Startups. We want to thank the VC and investor audience for coming to hear about this really exciting frontier industry. I'm joined by very esteemed and expert panelists. Firstly, Meagan Crawford. She's the managing partner of SpaceFund, venture capital fund investing in space startups and a leading female voice in the space industry. We're also joined by Brandon Weichert, author of Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower and an occasional subject matter expert for the Department of the Air Force on these issues of emerging technology. We're also joined by our two new chip portfolio companies, Quinn, CEO of Exos Aerospace, one of the only 10 companies in the US with a launch license, and one of the only 4 to have done a reusable launch alongside SpaceX and Blue Origin. And last but certainly not least, Adrian Tymes, the CEO and founder of CubeCab, positioned in the one-time use small payload high volume launch market and an alum of esteemed aerospace companies such as Maston Space Systems and the X Prize Foundation. My name is Stephen Malkowicz. I'm a venture associate here at NewChip, a industry agnostic global accelerator that services over 150 startup companies from pre-seed to Series A. During this panel, we're going to go over the basics of the space industry, the questions of who, why, what, where, when, how, and there's no better time than to kick off with the who. Who are our panelists, aside from the surface level introduction I've been able to give? Let's start with you, Meagan, and then we'll go around.
Great. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And just a little background on me. Before I jumped into this amazing, super fun world of space venture capital, I had operational experience running space startups of my own, including being chief operating officer at Deep Space Industries, the asteroid mining company, and starting and running Brand Delta V, which was the world's first dedicated marketing firm for the new space industry. I also am very pleased to have a podcast called Mission Eve, where I speak to other amazing women in the space industry with the hopes of inspiring more women to join us.
Thanks so much, Meagan. Brandon?
Thank you for having me. My background is mostly political. I have a master's in statecraft and national security affairs. I spent several years working on Capitol Hill. Space was one of the main portfolios I had while working there. And I quickly realized that it is a weak point for the U.S. This is the basis of my book, which is behind me to my shoulder. I think that the United States is susceptible right now to a space Pearl Harbor. Our satellites are very precarious, and we need to start innovating and reinvesting and reinvigorating the space industry. So I approach things. I have a national security background. As you noted in my bio, I'm an occasional subject matter expert for the Department of the Air Force, as well as now the Navy. And I usually talk to them these days about space, also being brought into Space Force, helping with some doctrinal concepts there. And so I think this is a great panel because I think the confluence of national security and economics and, sort of the who, what, when, where of the new space race, I think this panel is going to be an excellent place to start answering those questions. So thank you for having me.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Brandon. John, love to have your intro.
All right, so Exos Aerospace, I'm the CEO, and many of us know that Exos Aerospace is really about reusable rockets, but our goal and mission in life isn't to build and fly LEO-capable reusable rockets, but it's really about enabling all the brilliant minds around us to be able to change the world for the better. And obviously, rapid space, manufacturing of MSC stem cells is going to be one of our big approaches because that enables regenerative medicine, not taking drugs, but activating things that are inside your body that already do healing when you have organs shut down and things like that. Obviously, development of hypersonic technologies was a COVID shift for us, which is proving to be very interesting. And we're out there to help our warfighters to improve our national security and ultimately with the hypersonics to reduce point-to-point travel times. We have a global economy now. And with that, hypersonic capability is just going to help that flourish. So ultimately, our vision is to kind of combine the best of reusability, much like SpaceX has done. I mean, phenomenal accomplishments in a short amount of time there. And then also take what Virgin Orbit has done with air launch and take those two concepts, but instead of doing them separate, bring them together. So now you're talking air launch reusable, and we get out of the way of some of the airspace problems and, you know, single site launch infrastructure problems to allow us to put payloads into space on the right trajectory, and maybe not just satellite payloads, but things that come back where we leverage the microgravity of space to do manufacturing there to help humankind.
Very interesting. Adrian, love to hear more about you and what you're doing.
Okay, well, to start, correcting the intro, so it's my engineers who have the X Prize heritage, not myself. And Maston, I helped Dave Maston found Maston Space Systems. Some people might, anyway. So CubeCab is kind of taking the opposite approach from Exos. So whereas Exos is doing great stuff with reusability, we're looking into mass manufacturing so as to do very high launch volumes. And part of that is that we have to restrict ourselves to the smallest of satellites, CubeSats, because you can get 40 CubeSats to launch in a year. You can get 40 CubeSats to launch in a single launch. But getting 40 several ton satellites in a single year, that's a little more challenging. And then Brandon, we're running into, as a shakeout of our approach, a bunch of unique services that we can do for the defense industry. I'd love to have a conversation with you. Maybe we can touch on some of that in today's talk. Chief among them being that since we do plan to manufacture our rockets in bulk, we can set aside a few of them so that if there's an emergency launch need, hey, it's there. Whereas like SpaceX might take a month to do an emergency launch. Once we're up and running, if we have everything set up, the Pentagon could see on Monday they want a bird in the air. We could have it in the air that Tuesday.
Excellent.
And there are other things we could do to speed it up even further than that. Get it down to like minutes. Like Exos, we are pursuing the air launch. We're using F-104s out of Kennedy Space Center for our initial, and launching way out over the Atlantic. One of the things we were talking about prior to the call was currently when SpaceX does a launch, the airlines have to fly around them. There's a massive restricted space over Florida, and they're starting to complain. With us, the restricted space is out over the Atlantic. And we can tailor this to make sure we don't hit anyone important.
Well, I think that really speaks to the why now question that we want to get into. Obviously, for any entrepreneur, there's extreme opportunity cost to pursuing the venture you're doing at this time. For any venture capitalist deciding to raise a fund and focus on a specific industry, while there are other quote unquote hot trends such as blockchain or deep learning, to focus on a high capex industry like space is a very assertive move. And also for you, Brandon, since you're very in tune with the political climate, that also gives us a sense of, you know, why are these issues sensitive to what is going on now? So starting again with Meagan, why now? Why invest in space instead of blockchain or cannabis or any of these so-called hot industries?
Well, if you'll permit me to tell a short, hopefully a fairly short story here. I first got into the industry back in 2008 before Elon had ever had a successful launch. And so at that point, there were only a handful of space entrepreneurs, as you would call them. And I knew them all by name pretty much. At that time, I had really wanted to start a space-focused venture capital firm, but there weren't enough companies to build a diversified portfolio. There weren't any exits to speak of, you know, so how do you get your money back at the end of the fund, right? And so back then in 2009, I founded something called the New Space Business Plan Competition, which Adrian and CubeCab won one year, actually, which is now the world's longest running space-focused BPC. And that kind of was the nonprofit version of space venture capital, right? We gave out big checks like Publishers Clearinghouse style checks to the winners, and really helped kind of, you know, I had this really great perspective to watch the development of the industry, going from a handful of entrepreneurs to now SpaceFund is tracking more than 2,000 space startups around the world. So we've seen this massive increase, not just in the number of companies, but in the number of sectors that they're touching and the amazing ideas that these entrepreneurs are having. But really the key is, and I think everybody on the call would agree with this, that what has really opened the frontier is just like in the American West when the railroads were built. We now have railroads, right? We have low cost, frequent, reliable access to space. And with what the gentlemen on this call are doing, that's only going to increase. We're going to have increased frequency, increased reliability, and decreased cost. And in this new environment, business models close now that didn't close 5 years ago, right? And so the primary point of SpaceFund's thesis is it's not about launch, it's about what's being launched, right? Yeah. What are those companies that are taking advantage of this new capability that we have and these continually decreasing costs of launch? And that's where there's a lot of value being created right now and what SpaceFund was set up to capture.
That's an amazing perspective to be going back so far. Brandon, what's the answer to this why now question from a political and strategic sense for American, capitalism and industry?
Right. That's a great question. And Meagan, that was a wonderful answer. And you were absolutely right to hone in on the Wild West comparison there. It's all about infrastructure, isn't it? And so right now we have, over the last decade, really, we have watched several other countries and their corporate entities start to catch up with the United States technologically, specifically China. Russia is also in this game. I know there's a lot of talk about Russia being sort of this backward dying country, and in some ways it is, but they have been able to maintain their space capabilities. They held them over from the Soviet era. And so really you have great advances happening, not just in the United States. In fact, I would argue probably until very recently, they were really happening elsewhere. And now the US government is recognizing that, hey, not only are our friends starting to catch up to us, countries like France, which actually birthed their own Space Force about 2 years ago. Countries like Israel, which has a very robust satellite industry, all of it's related to the military, notably CubeSats. Also, India has been able to build out their capabilities, and this is all part of not just an economic desire, but a strategic desire. For India, obviously, they want to control, they want to have access to not only being able to surveil Kashmir and some of these areas of points of contention with Pakistan, but now also areas of contention with China in the Tibetan Plateau, in the Himalayas, and also in the Indian Ocean. So they need satellites to do that sort of over the horizon capabilities. So they're really intensifying their space programs. But with China in particular, we're seeing them go all across the board, not just in space, but in the tech sector in general, whether it be biotech, space tech, quantum computing interests or investments rather. It's really quite a robust program that they're invested in. And so when I worked on the Hill, one of the things and this is a story that I tell everybody, and this is in my book as well. My first day on the Hill, I was the lowest on the totem pole in the office, and my boss told me there's a meeting going on downstairs, and I found out it was in the basement, so it really wasn't that important. And it was a group of retired NASA and Air Force officials back in 2013. So this was around sequestration, and there was a lot of constrained budgets, very, very negative, well, back then, very negative political scene. And one of the things that they were saying was, hey, we have not been investing in our satellite capabilities very well. Our satellites are low-hanging fruits for our enemies to pluck. And we need to start investing in innovation to make those satellites more survivable so we don't lose them in a fight. We don't want to have a space Pearl Harbor. Well, nobody really cared. And the few congressmen who showed up, they didn't care. And so I went to brief my boss, and of course I found out he didn't care. And so that was sort of the genesis of my interest in this. And 7 years later, here we are. And the last 4 years have really been very progressive in terms of the space industry in America. It's a very controversial president we've had, but the one thing that he did do right was to really, I think, start to talk openly about space and to try to generate interest in it, whatever his other failings were. That is one of the positives. And so recognizing the strategic threat of a China that could potentially knock us out of the strategic high ground, that could potentially exploit things like asteroid mining before we could, which, is the world's first trillionaire will probably come from that industry. We are, I think, playing catch up, and I think that's the why. And that's why I think, unlike in the 90s, where there was a rapid interest in satellite private sector and then it kind of evaporated, I think this is going to be with us for a while. And the technology is now finally catching up to where we want to do these things.
Right. Well, speaking of industry, let's get to our founders. John, you mentioned low Earth orbiting LEO manufacturing, and there was recent funding news of Varda by top-tier venture capital firms like Founders Fund doing just that, low Earth orbital manufacturing for probably stuff like fiber optic cables, like you said, stem cells. So why now? Why is now the time for this growth in the reusable launch sector?
Yeah, for us, it comes back to really why I started this. I saw a program done by Center for Applied Space Technologies, kind of Larry Harvey's mission, along with Abba Zubair of Mayo Clinic. And 5 years ago, they had a program that put these stem cells on the ISS. And, here we are 5 years later, and we're reading the reports about how they've gone through phase 1 trials, very much funded out of their vision and their pockets even, but it took 5 years. And Larry Harvey's neighbor is actually out. We don't even know where he is. He's out walking around the world, but he had suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. He couldn't even walk. He was using a walker. And I saw that program and I said, if we can take the reusability that we've got on a suborbital vehicle, translate it to orbital, get away from the FAA problems, launch it from the air, we could literally put that same payload up, put it on orbit for 3 to 4 weeks that it requires for the gestation period of the cells and the growth that they need and everything else, and bring that back and literally treat thousands of people. Space allows that to happen in weeks, whether it's the G's, the microgravity environment, a combination of leaving the Earth's atmosphere. We don't know all the details on that yet. But what we do know is that we could condense into weeks what takes years, either on Earth or going through where you have to go to a space station. We have the technology to get beyond that.
So there's an urgency besides just an opportunity here, especially for these healthcare applications.
It's
Adrian,
urgent.
you mentioned.
Let me throw one thing in there where it really gets personal. It's urgent for me because my dad also had an MSc, or he also had a stroke. He's on the list to be treated, but they literally can't make enough. And it's not just about stroke. It's about Parkinson's. It's about heart disease. Right. It's about cancer research. They believe it'll broaden the capabilities across all those things. So yeah, it's a little bit personal too.
Thank you so much for sharing that, John. Adrian, you mentioned a little bit about FAA regulations and getting out of their way, especially since we've had this growth in the space industry. Why now? I mean, why, someone of your background, why are you pursuing this now instead of the latest AI, blockchain, VR startup?
Okay, well, first, thank you, Meagan, for the setup, but you knew what I was going to say. Why now is because opportunity. There's a lot of things you can do now in space that you couldn't do a decade ago. To get into launch, you have to be doing something outside of the spam of 100-kilogram payload disposable to orbit. I've talked to some people just last week that were proposing to do another, we'll launch 100 kilograms to orbit. There's nobody doing that, right? There's dozens. But if you're outside of launch, oh my, there's so many other opportunities that are coming up. One thing I kept pitching CubeCab was, we're like the 1850s gold rush. We're the guys who sell picks and pans to the prospectors. Those are the guys who got most reliably profitable. Well, we want to support the guys who are prospecting the idea space of what you can do in orbit. So there's Earth observation and telecommunications, which are traditional. They're not played out. There's still a lot of angles there. but I am hearing more and more unique ideas for what to do. I'm hearing, for instance, more space-based solar plays. There's active interest in all kinds of lunar things, like prospecting, set of manufacturing operations, so that you can more cheaply manufacture and launch stuff to Earth's orbit, or some stuff that you can manufacture better in partial gravity, but not zero gravity. John was talking about zero gravity, and then send that back to the Earth for applications. Or quantum or mechanical network. Trying to think. There's some things I'm under NDA on, so I can't mention the specific applications. But yeah, there are some people who are talking using their own private telecoms to do reduced latency for certain private operations. Don't think I can get too much more into that. Over on the warfighter side, just to give one example I was discussing just this morning, there's a company out there with a CubeSat engine, powerful enough that you could drop it down to less than 300 kilometers and overcome atmospheric drag. Military is calling this VLEO, very low Earth orbit. So what could you do with a satellite at 100 kilometers that you couldn't do with a satellite at 300 kilometers? Better observation for the same hardware, lower latency satellite comms. I will just briefly mention viable boost phase intercept, and anyone who recognizes that can contact us. Anyone who doesn't, don't worry about it.
Yes.
But yeah, just there's idea after idea after idea after idea after idea that it's possible to pursue these days that you couldn't do a decade ago. And now that it's possible to pursue them, well, if you're the only one pursuing them, and make sure that you are, or at least there's not that many, then you can establish and dominate the market. First mover advantage. It's right now.
That's a very, very compelling.
Can I just
argument.
also piggyback on that real quick? So the first mover advantage aspect, this is something that China and their state enterprises, they are fixated on like a laser. They believe that by getting there first, they can not only gain the first mover advantage economically, but they will be able to displace the United States in the strategic high ground of orbit. This is why they are looking at, and you are absolutely correct, is that's the buzzword over there right now. So,
right. So, hey, Space Star entrepreneurs, how would you like to beat out China?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to get into a bit of contention here and disagreement among the panelists. And I'm going to give Meagan the floor here, because what we want to go here now is, what is the state of space? What does the space market look like? What are the key metrics in terms of the number of launches, costs, fundings, and new companies? And Meagan, you've put out a white paper at the 70th International Astronautical Conference in DC, a very data-intensive paper that essentially says there is an oversupply in the launch vertical. And you can see how that is contentious to some of our launch founders, but you have a very strong data argument to back that up. I want to give you the floor right now to explain your findings and thesis there. Allow Brandon then to address that from a strategic perspective, and then let John and Adrian talk about how they're pursuing their companies in light of that market analysis. Meagan?
You're on mute, Meagan.
She'll get it.
Excellent. Thank you. So yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. That's we did do quite a bit of analysis on this industry, and that was a little over a year ago now that we published that paper. So some of the data has changed, but we're currently tracking 162 launch companies right now around the world. And those are the companies that are still alive. We've tracked over 200 companies over time, and many of those companies have since failed or disappeared or otherwise, gone up in smoke, if you will. So and the question is, we have 9 operational launch companies right now. Is there room in the market for these other 152 companies, 151 companies? And the answer is not right now. There is not. So we expect 50,000 satellites to launch over the next 5 to 7 years. Fully 2/3 of those will be the Starlink constellation if it gets anywhere as big as Elon is projecting it to be. And so immediately you have to take those satellites out of your target market, because I guarantee you those Starlink satellites are going up on a SpaceX launch. So if you are not SpaceX, Starlink is not a part of your addressable market, right? And so same with the Kuiper constellation that Amazon's putting together. Although they've said they'll look at other launch providers, do we really believe that they're going to do anything but fly on Blue Origin, right? So you take that chunk out of your addressable market. Now you're still left with a pretty significant market, right? Tens of thousands of satellites that will launch. But with the combination of the 9 existing players, we believe there's only room in the market for 6 to 8 more companies to survive. So, that gets us to a total of somewhere between 15 and 20 launch companies worldwide. And that includes, the Chinese capability, and there's several other nations that want their own launch capability. The UK, France has their own launch capability, Russia, of course. But you'll see some of these national interests, where maybe it wouldn't economically make sense to have a launch company in the UK, but it's important to the UK government. It's important to the Ministry of Defense that they have that capability onshore. And so some of those companies will be propped up, even if the economics might not be there for them. But for the most part, for these truly commercial companies, it's going to be a bloodbath out there competing for these customers. Now, we do expect the space market to continue to increase. We do expect more satellites to be launched. We do expect new capabilities like, microgravity research to be using some of those, some of that launch capability in the future. But where we're really interested in is in those technologies that can disrupt the traditional rocket paradigm. Rockets are loud, big, expensive, require lots of airspace. They're not very green at all, right? And so are there technologies, are there different ways of doing things that can disrupt this kind of traditional rocket paradigm? That's interesting to us from a SpaceFund perspective. But as far as if you're just trying to just do a traditional, light the candle at one end, rocket goes to space company, you're late. You're way too late to the party. The time to invest in traditional launch was 6, 8, 10 years ago, when these companies that you're seeing be successful now were just getting started, your SpaceX's and Rocket Labs of the world.
Well, this is a very rigorous white paper. I invite everyone to go to spacefund.com and look at, the tracking that you've set up. John, you're in Texas as well. You're part of this emerging space supercluster. I think it's not unlikely that we're going to see Exos Aerospace employee and alumni go on to found some other great space companies in the future. How do you see this physical landscape of the space industry evolving?
Yeah, part of our master plan is what we call a national charter enterprise. We've been working on it for 3 years. We recognize that there is worldwide contribution. There are just advantages of different places. I got about a month before I head to Italy to sign contracts for our first national charter enterprise. And the funny thing is, it's actually our second. The first one we started 3 years ago. From the concept, we found another region in Italy that really could support our LEO launcher vehicle build with just hardware. And, there are certain clusters that have capabilities that can be leveraged in other economies. So Exos Aerospace Italia, SRL, is up and running with cooperation agreements and MOUs in place. And now we're getting to contract after 3 years. We've also last year went to Australia. There are great advantages for Australia. Southern launch. We can go to certain orbits. If you look at equatorial launch Australia, they're 4 degrees off of the equator. Guess what? There's another great advantage that we have there, even from air launch, just taking off from the coast, not flying out too far, getting away from the people side. So there are economic and there are just regional advantages that companies that are going to be around in 5 or 10 years and be in that mix of 6 or 8 that are providing their scale of launch, are going to have to be doing different things than what a single company tied to infrastructure and architecture here in the US can do.
That's interesting. So we're going to see regional hubs, but they're going to provide services internationally to various international players across the globe. Adrian, in Silicon Valley, what's been the heart of American innovation for the last 2 decades, but operating, like you said, off the coast of Florida, and we've seen with John, you know, we can have headquarters in one place and operations internationally. How do you see the geography of this playing out?
Yeah, so CubeCab is already distributed operations, headquarters in Silicon Valley, launch operations down in K2C, Florida, and possibly other things that I'm not at liberty to discuss on this call. But yeah, and if you're not a launch company, where do you need to be? There isn't really a physical location. I mean, yeah, access to manufacturing, but that's more and more distributed these days. Access to talent, especially in this coronavirus era, there has been a lot more awareness of the possibility of doing online collaboration, yes, which I personally have been soaked in since the 80s. No, seriously, at one point I was just running a software effort with engineers on every continent except Antarctica. Wow. Yeah. And this was in the 80s, pre-web. Yeah. So that was also one of my first jobs, but anyway. Yeah, so if you have access to the talent and access to the knowledge and you can manufacture what you want, if you're a satellite company, you're manufacturing a satellite, you ship it off to a launch company, and you probably want to have flexibility to interact with any launch company that can they can launch your stuff, be it in any country, and they send it off to space. You are not in space. So yeah, where do you need to be? You can afford to be distributed. Yes, there's going to be natural manufacturing and innovation hubs like there have always been, but the minimum infrastructure needed to participate is really low.
So a vision for a distributed space future. I mean, we've heard some really diverse perspectives here, from the locations of these future clusters, service internationally, and then fully distributed teams. I want to finally get to the topic of how we're innovating and when we're going to see these innovations in the market, kind of combining these last 2 topics. Adrian, you very keenly mentioned the data and analytics plays that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And so now going back to Meagan, you have a diverse portfolio in SpaceFund, not only in physical hardware and infrastructure, but in software, AI, material sciences, services. So what do you think are going to be the 1 to 2 key technological drivers or these methods of innovation that's going to drive the next decade of innovation in space? And how do you see the timeline for these techs coming to market?
You know, as opposed to picking specific technologies, I'd like to contextualize this from a market need perspective, right? So right now, there's more data being collected in space than can either be processed, stored, or downlinked. Right. So when we look at the Malaysia Airlines incident, we know that there were pictures taken of that flight. But those pictures were over the ocean. Nobody pays for Earth observation data of the ocean. And so those pictures were immediately deleted because there's memory issues on all of these satellites. They don't have enough storage on board to be able to keep everything, especially things that customers aren't paying for. There's also not enough downlink capability. This comes from a combination of not having access to ground stations all the time. When you're in orbit, you're only over the ground station certain times, and you're limited by your bandwidth of how many bits and bytes you can get down during those passes. So I think we're going to see significant innovations around the moving of data in and around space. Switch from RF to laser comm that's coming. There's going to be a lot of great innovations there. We're going to see data storage and processing on orbit. I think that you're going to see increases in battery technology, storage capability, right? All of the Moore's Law stuff that's helped make the CubeSat revolution possible. As you know, as everything continues to get smaller and cheaper, right? That's going to continue to drive innovation in the space industry. But really, it's around that kind of moving of data, storing, processing, and moving of data. I think we're going to see a lot of technical innovations around that. And then I'm also really, really excited. Something that we've touched on a little bit briefly here and there throughout the call is this idea of mining. space resources.
Yes.
Now, I'm looking at my fund is a 10-year fund. I don't know that that space mining is going to be real profitable and ready for an exit within the lifetime of this current fund. But what I am seeing is nodes of that future in space supply chain already starting to develop.
Yes. Yes.
So for instance, one of the first things that will be mined from asteroids is water, right? Well, obviously humans need water for a lot of reasons, but if you have hydrogen and oxygen, now you have rocket fuel, right? And so where are you going to take that rocket fuel though? Right. Well, there needs to be a fuel depot already in orbit, ready to receive that water from that asteroid mining mission. In order to make that asteroid mining mission feasible to begin with, you have to have a customer ready for your product, right? And so that's one of our portfolio companies. I'll give a shout out to Orbit Fab that are building gas stations in space. And this is a product and service that all 50,000 of those satellites that are about to launch that I mentioned earlier, this is a refueling service is something that could be useful to all of them in the near term in LEO, but it's also, again, an important node in that future in-space supply chain. And so I think we're going to see a lot of innovations happening around in-space manufacturing, around this kind of physical infrastructure needed to build out that in-space supply chain that's going to be coming over the next decade or so.
That's tremendously exciting. The idea that the fueling stations of the future are already being built right now. Brandon, you were enthusiastically agreeing about the space mining point, and you've already said that you think the first trillionaire will come from space mining. So love to hear your perspective.
So in 2014, when I was on the Hill, I was part of the group that we had pushed through the Space Launch Competitiveness Act, and we basically it allows a private American company that can reach, for instance, an asteroid to harvest the material there and sell it back on Earth. And there's a huge interest just from meeting with representatives and whatnot at the time. I learned about this very huge interest, and I'm sure Meagan could probably give more detail on in rare earth mineral mining in space. We know that the Chinese have been, from a strategic standpoint, again, the Chinese have been very interested in trying to dominate the rare earth mineral market on Earth. They're very worried about being cut off in the event of a strategic, crisis between us and them. The Pentagon has the old air-sea battle concept, but there's also Colonel Hames's old offshore control program, which basically would allow our Navy to go outside of where we think the Chinese Navy could interdict and to basically blockade China from afar, so they won't be able to gain oil, rare earth minerals. So one of the things that China's strategists are looking at is, can we go to space and bring the stuff there down to Earth so that there's a new supply chain that's not as heavily dependent on American military or that will be as heavily threatened by American military capability. And so the Chinese are also looking at the supply chain idea, and this is why all of their moon missions are so important to them. These are proofs of concept. It's also obviously to get in the history books, but China is looking at, for instance, the southern pole of the moon to colonize there. I know that NASA wants to colonize the southern pole as well. There's kind of this race for real estate popping up between the two powers. And China is targeting, kind of like staking out all the water holes in the desert. They're targeting these research-rich areas. They're going to put their flag there, eventually initially it'll be an automated operation, and then they'll staff it out and then they're going to build out the supply chain coming back. And the demand is already there, obviously, because it's a Chinese state need, these resources. With America, with the West, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit different, but it's still there. But for China, this is all about achieving the ambition of being not just self-sufficient, but of being the great power on Earth. And that's by dominating these new areas of space and dominating the markets there. If they can ensnare the world to be dependent on their their new innovations, their new markets, they've already beaten the Americans in the long run. That's part of their winning without fighting strategy, or winning without warfare strategy. And so what Meagan was talking about is I hear it from the private sector end, but me being a government guy for the first half of my career, I immediately jump in and start thinking, remembering what I was being briefed on and whatnot. So.
No, that is very key insight, and something that is going to drive demand on a government level. John, Adrian, you guys are going to have the last word to share what you think about either your own technologies or other technologies you're seeing in the marketplace, and hold back what you need to hold back for competitive purposes. But we'll start with you, John.
Really, I think we're going into a realm where space is enabling a better life on Earth. And ultimately, the best things we come up with for space today are just capabilities that enable all the other industries to leapfrog where they are now. Anything from battery technologies to solar to power generation to AIs and bots. I mean, space just opens up that entire environment. I think we're going to see a whole lot more than what we're talking about today. And the real winners is ultimately going to be the human race, as we have capabilities that we never imagined even 5-10 years ago. We have, I look for the end of disease, right? Where we actually have a way to use things that are naturally in our body to end disease, because we just can't treat it on Earth, because Earth's environment isn't like inside our body. So when you start opening those things up, I think that's what we're going to be talking about 5 or 10 years from now, as we realize that leapfrog event has happened.
Adrian.
Okay, so you wanted innovations that are going to drive. The first one I'm going to say is infrastructure, and that's a bit of a cop-out since it encompasses multiple things. This includes better development of laser comms and other communication, total communication capability. It includes more launch capability. There's a screaming unmet demand for launch in certain sectors. I mean, even if there's not enough demand to support hundreds more launch companies, Meagan was saying tens of thousands more satellites. How many satellites per year are getting launched these days? Maybe 1,000, probably. I think it's less, maybe more, depending on how you count. Anyway, so whoever gets in is going to have to step up. But like, I can go to any university in America with an active space program today, and they can give me chapter and verse about their woes getting their satellites launched. There is still a lot of work to do. Yes. You have to address the niches that aren't being addressed, because those niches are already being addressed. The countries are just going to build up, and that's going to be the primary way we address that. Like Meagan said, SpaceX is going to be launching the Starlink. You better bet they're going to be doing a lot more launches to launch all those things. But anyway, so the further establishment of infrastructure is going to reduce the cost to do the rest of the missions to the point where more and more things become feasible. It's an enabling effect. And then the second one is kind of the same, Moore's Law. Yes, Moore's Law may be slowing down a little bit, but it's still ongoing. You can do stuff with CubeSats today you couldn't even dream of doing with CubeSats a few years ago. So what would you be able to do with a CubeSat in 2023, 2025? And better yet, the CubeSat, I meant to bring this up in a previous one. So US companies are a little hobbled by the International Traffic Arms Regulations, ITAR laws, which basically say no US person can give technical data about stuff on the US munitions list to any non-US person, with certain exceptions. One of those exceptions is anything in the public domain. The CubeSat standard is in the public domain for this purpose. In fact, previous editions specifically marked, this is not ITAR restricted, this is public domain. So a company like ours, yeah, we can talk to CubeSat launch standard or satellite standard with foreign companies all day long, no problem. And more stuff is going to fall into this. And this also includes increasing modularization of, okay, CubeSat standard says the satellite has to be yay big, yay massive, and it's got a few other electromechanical interaction specifications, which basically say, okay, you don't make the rocket specific to the satellite. You make the satellite to the standard, the rocket launches to the standard, and then the satellite guys can go off and do whatever. I see the same kind of thing popping up for communications, like, say, certain certain established standards for standard laser comm frequencies as opposed to having to custom develop. And you better bet the FCC is worried about this because currently they derive their authority to regulate some space stuff by the fact that they regulate anything radio. So basically anything going up has radio telemetry. They lose that authority for laser comm currently.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, your regulator who says, okay, we're the FCC, we can say what your orbital lifetime is and your orbital debris mitigation plan and all that is because you have to have telemetry licensing. What happens when your authority goes away and you have to trust the FAA to do this?
So
and
we're
the FAA is starting to step up and do more and more of that. That's specific U.S. politics. But given how dominant America is in space, it's something for people to be aware of if they want to start operating space.
And I can tell you that over the last year and a half, I have had probably 15 to 18 different meetings with with this organization that I have been out of the blue. They wanted to talk to me about satellite management related to this issue. So I think you are correct. The government is trying to always play catch up, so
only 18.
Well, for me, I'm a military kind of strategist guy. So, but they wanted some inputs from an SME like me. So I went in and did what I could.
Yeah.
So
so the emphasis is evolution, not so much revolution, is going to be the primary driver. Yeah. But the evolution is going to enable certain revolutions to come within the budget of what people can do.
Yeah,
because most people do not have billions of dollars to do a space effort, but being able to raise a few 100,000, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, we're seeing drivers here in the regulatory realm, telecom, supply chain, healthcare, unexpectedly, perhaps for some. Thank you all for this wide-ranging conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Investors, I want you, if you're interested in co-investing or learning more about space, to go to spacefund.com, contact Meagan. She is an leading expert in this space. Go to Amazon and buy Brandon's book. Brandon, what's the title again?
Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower.
And every dollar you spend on Amazon gets funneled into Blue Origin. So it's a double whammy.
Exactly. And most importantly, request meetings now with John and Adrian, because these are going to be the companies of the future. Thank you, everyone, for attending New Chip Demo Day. We'll see you later.
Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good one.